The African Union officially took its seat at the table of the world's richest and most powerful countries, commonly known as the G20, at the 18th summit of the bloc in New Delhi, India's capital, last weekend. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced this in his opening speech at the summit, where he officially invited a representative of the African Union to take his place as a permanent member of the G20. Africa had only been marginally represented within the G20 through South Africa's seat, an AU's invited international organization title, despite representing about 1.4 billion people and about 10% of the world's economy. Elated by the new development, Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, while addressing the leaders, expressed his country's commitment to play a vital role within the G20. He thereafter called for global unity and cooperation. Olusiji Aina, development economist and board member, U.S.-Africa Trade Council, Abuja, Nigeria, and Ryder, director, development, re-emergent, joining from Turkey, and also George Brown, management consultant, River State, of course, will be joining me on today's show. Glad to have you join me.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
All right, now let me start off with you, of course, Mr. Aina, on the will I call it concluded G20 18th G20 summit, where Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced that the African Union has been included as a member of the summit of the committee, making it the 21st member. What does this portend for the African continent?
Again, good evening, and thank you so much for having me. It portends quite a number of things. Again, it will give African countries voice in the G20. You will agree with me that G20, they are global war powers, and they decide so many things that happen across the world. And I think with the admission of AU now, we give opportunities to African countries to be able to lend their voice in terms of decade infrastructure in the continent, healthcare, as well as other kinds of finances that will come into the continent. So it's a good thing, the right time, and I think at this point, we should have a reason to also stop complaining about negligence. It's an opportunity for us to harness our potential, to leverage on the strength of one another, and be able to pull, strength and give Africa a voice and the opportunity it deserves in the Committee of Other Nations.
I would like to go to you, Hannah. I mean, this is a big one for Africa. I mean, looking at the past, where the continent was perceived or used to be perceived as maybe a donor continent. I mean, looking at this in the light of the future, what do you see happening, particularly Africa being regarded amongst the Committee of Nations, Hannah?
First of all, let's be calling it the G21 now, shouldn't we?
Exactly. I mean,
that's number one step. One step. But yes, absolutely. This is a recognition, I think, both from the African side, that we should be better represented. We deserve to be better represented in these global institutions. This is a position we've had since 2009, that the African Union should be part of the G20. But we also have many other international institutions that we do want better representation. And it's not only representation in terms of, how we can get our ideas across better, and we can make sure that the African continent is seen in a better light than just being sort of recipient of aid or charity. But it's also about us shaping the world in a way that actually works better. And having gone through the processes that we've gone through, we are 1.4 billion people. We know quite a lot. We have 55 member states. We know quite a lot. We can help the world, and we can help the G20, the rest of the G21, to do better.
All right, I want to go to you, George Brown. I mean, how important will you say Africa is in the global economy?
Thanks for having me. Africa is at a crossroads at the moment. Speaking, the global south is the darling of the rest of the world. And Africa is in this mix. The political dimensions into all the things that are going on in Africa at the moment goes to tell the fact, or goes to display the fact, that Africa is the darling of everybody at the moment. And that is basically because of the change in paradigm in terms of geopolitics. But again, what does Africa has to benefit by being in the G20? What is the benefit of Africa? A continent of 55 countries and over 1.4 billion people, made up of over 50 to 55% of people that are under 20, or people that are under 35. It's a powerhouse. It's a powerhouse of opportunities. Yet you lump 55 countries together and say it's just one seat. And that's why the BRICS, I think, is doing something totally different. So I don't really see the gains that Africa going forward will benefit. After mere rhetoric, we had the AGOA, we had the African Free Continental Trade Agreement. Of what benefits have those agreements been?
So are you, sorry to cut in, are you saying that Africa being a part of this group to a very large extent, would not be beneficial? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, going beyond the rhetorics. And let's look at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Look at, has Africa benefited? What are accumulating in those initiatives? What benefits have they brought to Africa? What benefits have they brought to African countries outside AIDS and cutting away of raw materials? I don't really see anything being different.
All right. We have a little bit of communication glitch there with, of course, George Brown, but we'll get straight to George Brown. I want your reaction, however, Hannah. You said that this is a big milestone for Africa, but George is saying that at the end of the day, this might not be in any way beneficial to Africa. What's your take, Hannah?
Well, I have to beg to disagree with that one. I think, we have to look at all of these different groups on their own merits and for what kinds of functions they're set up for. So I don't think we can compare G21 to the BRICS, the new BRICS formation, for example. They're doing very different things, even though sometimes they do cover some of the same issues. They have very different functions, just like the G7 does different things to the G20. There are different reasons why they're there. But I think what this is doing with the African Union coming into the G21 is basically correcting a historical imbalance. The European Union was created in its early formation only 6 years before the Organization of African Unity, which was the predecessor to AU. And that was created after colonialism, very soon after colonialism. And, we have been working towards regional integration, yet for some reason, when the G20 was created, only the EU was invited, but the AU wasn't invited to be a permanent member. So this is correcting a historical imbalance, but I think, again, we can use it to our advantage. The G20, you can think of it as the equivalent of the UN Security Council, but just for economic and financial issues. This is where the big decisions in terms of our finance, whether it's the IMF issuance of special drawing rights, these things or other type, what is the scale of the COVID-19 response? What is the G20? What is the debt framework for dealing with debt issues for countries? How does that work? How do trade regimes really work? And what are we going to be? These are the things that this particular group decides on, or at least their views are the ones that come to the fore. And so having the AU at the table, the AU president, chairperson, and the AU commission at the table representing the African member states, as well as South Africa, of course, will at least give us a much bigger opportunity to be able to influence those things in our interest. And there is plenty of evidence that we have not been able to influence those things in our interest. Definitely not to the degree that others have been able to. But now, we're saying, well, we're just as important as Italy in making these decisions. And I think that's an obvious, it's an obvious equation, right? So yeah, I think there's plenty of benefits that we may be able to, that we should be able to accrue from this new seat.
All right, Olusiji, I want your thoughts on this. Do you think that, Africa being a part of officially now being a part of the G20 will actually make a difference, on the continent?
Oh, I totally agree with the last speaker. It will make a whole lot of difference. There will be a shift in the power dynamics. You can't compare when we rely on them solely on aid, and whatever they give to us is what we take. This time around, we are looking at being part of the decision-making board, and we are going to sit on the same table with them to look at issues from holistic view in terms of what is needed in the entire continent, in terms of trade, in terms of healthcare, in terms of poverty reduction, infrastructural development, and a whole lot of that. So it's going to be a different narrative. It's not the way it was or it used to be. We are not just invited to come and as just an invited guest. African Union will sit with Italy, we sit with world powers to take decisions in terms of quite a number of things that will happen. So I don't believe that it's going to be business as usual. It's totally going to be a departure from what it has always been. The question perhaps will be how we're able to foster collaboration with the world powers in terms of who leads the African Union. And that is one thing I see with the internal issues that we need to, perhaps the AU will have to fight for. Nigeria, for example, is perceived to be, the giant of Africa. South Africa is there. So who is going to lead AU at what point, for how long? I may see a bit of that part also within who leads AU or who does what with what. But in terms of Africa as a whole, 1.4 billion people, 55 countries, it's a total shift, it's a total departure from the traditional way of sending aid to Africa without even listening, even caring about the things we need. But this time, we will sit on the same table to review issues, to take decisions together on issues that affect the entire continent. So that is the position. But again, don't forget how AU is able to manage their internet crisis in terms of who takes what, who lead what, who does what with. The G20 is a total conversation entirely, which we have to look at it holistically. But in terms of the African Union itself, it's a good one. And honestly speaking, there's nothing anybody can say more than to expect good things to happen in the years ahead.
Olusiji, I want to stay on you. Now, let's bring it to Nigeria. We understand that in a bid to boost Nigeria's economic growth, the Tinubu administration said the government is introducing new incentives to attract large-scale manufacturers to establish a presence in Nigeria. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we know that the president of Nigeria actually attended the G20 summit. It is also a major player when it comes to regional politics in Africa, being the chairman of the ECOWAS. How do you consider this, given our current infrastructure as a nation, to be able to compete favorably globally?
We will. And one of the things I see, was when I listened to the ministerial briefing, by Mr. Wale Edun on, the next line of action in terms of what the government intends to do. It is obvious and it's a known fact that the government cannot go the way of borrowing, looking at our revenue to GDP or our revenue, to debt ratio. It is something that we cannot, sustain. And then the government made it very clear, I'm not going to borrow. So what he has done at this point is to look at, development finance related instruments. So many infrastructures we are coming into the country in terms of how to improve what we have. And if you look at the 14-point-something billion, deals is signed in India, they are largely going to be, working under development finance instrument, build, operate, and transfer. So largely it's going to be off balance sheet funding. And Nigeria is gradually, tilting towards taking the rightful, leadership in Africa, looking at some of the decisions that the government has taken in the last 100 days or less. So I believe Nigeria is also going to compete, very seriously with the leadership of African Union. After all, if you ask yourself, perhaps in the last 10 years, what has AU done? The voice of AU has been practically silent over so many things. And if you look at the way the president emerged as the ECOWAS lead, and the way the entire, West African leaders rally around him, and the kind of decisions he's taking, the way he's leading the front, you will know that he's pursuing something. I wouldn't be surprised if before the end of this year or early next year, the president of Nigeria is announced as the AU leader. That is obviously something that is in the pipeline. which I believe will come. And the whole idea is also to be able to attract more infrastructural development into the country. And looking at the model that the president is using, then you can be rest assured that the kind of infrastructures we needed are going to come in no time. Because this is not a situation where government just sits and announce, a certain project and spend X amount of trillion of naira that you cannot account for. This is what is a total departure. What we're going to be having now are largely off-balance sheet funding, which is going to be development finance instruments. So build, operate, and transfer, build, operate, and own concessions, and a whole lot of that PPP arrangement, which is what we should expect. And the president is leading the war around that. You can see he had a stopover in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and it has to do with a whole lot of discussions within the aviation sector. So the man is serious. The question again will be, those working with him, if they really understand how to be able to process and push some of the interventions or some of the programs that is leading in a way that we can begin to see the ripple effect or the impact on the people and on the country over the period of years. That again is another conversation for another day. But in terms of the presidential leadership and what we have at the moment, I believe we are going for something higher, and I believe we'll be able to lead, peacefully in the next couple of months as we pursue to see things happen.
All right, I'll come back to you, Mr. Olusiji. But right now, I want to go to George Brown, if he's been able to connect with us. George, if you can hear me, I want your reaction on Nigeria's involvement with the G20 this year. I mean, Nigeria is saying, you know what? We are opening our doors for global manufacturers, global businesses to come and invest. But we know the challenges that even local businesses in the country are facing to stay afloat. I mean, there's infrastructural deficit amongst others. How do you think Nigeria can compete, or do you think Nigeria has what it takes to invite global partners and keep them in the country?
Nigeria has all it takes to make great leap of progress. But we have our systemic issues and challenges with regards to ease of doing business. And if you want to set up a business in Nigeria, basically you have to go through silos of ministries, silos of departments and agencies, doing registration, going back and forth before being able to set up shop. Now, those are the basics. Those are basic requirements that you need to start business or open shop in Nigeria. And what has the government really done in terms of improving ease of doing business in Nigeria? Doing business in Nigeria is not easy for Nigerians. It's not easy for Nigerian entrepreneurs. And now you're going to ask the world to come here, open shop, and start manufacturing, which is actually what Nigeria really needs as the catalyst of our growth in the future. We just need manufacturing, and that's what we need. I think differently from the way the markets are now, and I think differently from how I think Nigeria needs to grow. We have the market already, and we should be encouraged. The government should incentivize businesses in Nigeria, manufacturing and selling in country, because the market is huge. So if the government is unable to incentivize Nigerian manufacturers to go into selling to this 230 million people in this country, then I don't think wooing investors into this country to come and start manufacturing, basically where the infrastructure is not really available and the bottlenecks of ease of doing business is not being sorted out. So how do you expect going beyond or moving on? How do you expect this win of investors coming into value, the much needed value that Nigerians deserve? How do we get that? How do we get the matrix? How do we go about infrastructure issues, cost of power, cost of labor, not just making Nigerians to earn cheap wages, but to earn living wages, not basically around benchmark world-class benchmark, but around the products that the manufacturers are putting forward and the buying power of the Nigerian. And after that, we can start looking at the regional markets. And until as Africans were able to start trading amongst ourselves as African countries, until we start trading among ourselves as African countries cannot grow their manufacturing base at all. I don't think so.
Well, I want to come to you, Hannah. I mean, if you have a reaction to what George said, it's fine. But my question to you is this. What are the pressing global economic issues that you think should have been trashed out, at the summit? I mean, given post-COVID and a situation where many global economies are currently struggling?
Well, I think, the G21 and some of the issues that have been spoken about already, things like food inflation, the COVID-19 response, of course. We also just had last week the Africa Climate Summit led by President Ruto, and that obviously climate change being a major issue for us. Also, we talked about there's also, of course, debt issues as well. We've already mentioned Nigeria's debt to GDP ratio and so on, and other countries are having similar constraints. But I have to say, one of the reasons why G21 matters and why African Union in G21 matters is that we cannot do this all alone. We cannot only trade amongst ourselves just by ourselves. A lot of our trade is just like that, also because of the international trading rules that we are part of. We have debt to GDP ratios that are high debt servicing in particular because of international financial rules. We have credit rating agencies. We've got debt sustainability frameworks, which are heavily biased towards African countries. And we're not going to be able to change that just by having conversations amongst ourselves, and definitely not by having the others having conversations amongst themselves without us. So that's why G21 matters. That's also why African representation in a whole set of different international institutions really matters. And it matters that we as Africans, citizens, think tanks, private sector, governments, that we are all also focused on how do we influence the rest of the world to work in our interest, not only just be part of it. And I think this is a shift that we're slowly making and realizing that we really must make.
Before, of course, I allow you, gentlemen and lady, to go. I mean, it's important that we also respond to this particular question. And I would appreciate probably a 30 seconds response. I'll start with you, Olusiji, Aina. One of the talks right now is that due to the foreign exchange, well, I call it upheaval, it goes up and down, and we know the impact on the local economy. There has been talks for maybe, a regional, a means of exchange away from the dollar. And right now we are seeing Africa being part of the G20 right now. How do we reconcile this, particularly with agitations that maybe Africa should have its own means of transaction aside the dollar? What do you have to say to this?
All right, I think that is very important. We must be able to trade efficiently among ourselves in a way that Nigeria can buy goods from Ghana and pay in local cities or pay Naira. You should be able to procure goods from, from South Africa and pay in rands, and at the same time, pay Naira. That is very critical. As we go to G20 now, G21, we must go, we mustn't go divided. We must go united, as a united front. It's very critical, it's very important. Because if we do go to G21 divided, then we're going to have problems. We will not be able to achieve all of the things that's been spelled out in AFCFTA that we want to achieve. So it doesn't really matter. What is important is going there united, going there with a common front, and most importantly, ensuring that we carry the other smaller countries who are not as big as Nigeria, South Africa, along in this conversation to ensure that whatever we do is in the interest of the entire 1.4 billion people in Africa. That is very critical. That is very important. And I tell you the truth, that will enable us to be able to negotiate better and stand in a position, of strength rather than in the position of weakness.
All right, thank you so much. I would have loved to take the reaction of our other two, of course, discussants, but we are pressed with time. Once again, thank you so much for your time and, of course, for joining the conversation. Olusiji Aina, that's a development economist and board member, U.S.-Africa Trade Council. And Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and of course Takiye, and of course George Brown, a management consultant, Rivers State, Nigeria. Once again, thank you so much, gentlemen and lady.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it.
All right. And of course, the show continues after now. Stay with us.